Good morning, everybody. I think, what's this, week 3 of remote learning now? So we've done 2 weeks on Macbeth. I thought we'd do one last week on Macbeth. So hopefully you've had lots of time to practice the process of writing about the play, taking the knowledge you already had that you learned with your teachers, revising it, recalling it, and then practice using it in essay-style tasks. So just thought we'd do one more week of that, 4 more sessions, and then we'll shift on to something different next week. Again, I'm not going to try and teach you new stuff. What I'm going to try and teach you is how to use what you know. So we'll do some work on Macbeth, we'll do work on Dickens, Blood Brothers, the poems you've done. And if you've done lots of practice remotely and at home on stuff you already know, it will mean when we get back to school, we can use the time to teach you the new stuff, okay? So what I thought we'd look at today is the witches, or this week, because the witches are interesting in this play, aren't they? They don't appear a lot, but they have such a huge impact on what happens. The attitudes to witchcraft at the time the play was written are so extreme and so interesting. So I thought if we spend a few lessons talking about the witches, thinking about the witches, and as I say, move on away from Macbeth next week. So what I'm going to do in this first session, exactly the same as last week's first session, is just to recall things you've already been taught. You will already have gone through the witches sections, your teachers will have taught you about them, but I'm conscious you might have forgotten. So I'm just going to do some review and revisiting content, context, and then we'll do some application in the future sessions. Okay, so I think the first thing just to revise and to revisit is to the fact that at the time Macbeth was written, attitudes to witches were extreme, whereas now witches are commonly seen in a slightly light-hearted and comical way. We dress up as them for Halloween. Obviously, Harry Potter movies Harry Potter books mean that the representation of witches has shifted to being really quite positive in some ways. So our whole worldview about witchcraft is very different. But in Shakespeare's time, people not only believed in them, but they believed that they had made a pact with the devil. That the reason they had power is because they were representing the devil on earth. So at a time when everybody's religious and everybody believes in God and the devil as the source of evil, the idea of witchcraft is terrifying. And the important thing to know is it's not just the uneducated and the lower classes who believe in witchcraft, it goes right to the top. Henry VIII brought in legislation which allowed the persecution of witches, allowed witches to be executed for very flimsy evidence. Elizabeth I, after him, she also had laws and rules that meant that witches could be treated in this way. But then we have James I, who ascends the throne after Elizabeth, and he is perhaps the most superstitious of all. Historians have all kinds of views about why he was so superstitious about witches. Largely, it's thought he had his own personal experience where he was travelling at sea and was caught in a terrible storm that he was lucky to survive, and that perhaps that was the source of his paranoia. He couldn't understand the natural phenomena or the scientific phenomena that he had experienced, so he blamed the supernatural. Okay, but regardless, the idea that witches are evil and that witches are real and that they have made a pact with the devil is important to understanding their perception and their use in the play. Terrible things were done to witches, as I'm sure you know from both history and from your English lessons. Ducking stalls, being burnt, being drowned, all kinds of terrible things. But the act passed in 1563 meant that it was legal to kill witches, because they believed they used spirits to kill people, so they needed to be killed. Okay, so here is a couple of links. Obviously, these slides I'm using to generate this short video are on Show My Homework. So if you'd like to read up a little bit more about witchcraft in Shakespeare's England, these 2 links are particularly good, really interesting stuff in there. I think when we consider witchcraft and the persecution of witches at the time, we also have to consider it alongside patriarchy. And hopefully you remember from last week's session that patriarchy is all about male power, a world which is dominated by men. And the fact it was a patriarchal society and that women were powerless seems to perhaps to be relevant. And another word that's linked to patriarchy, although more extreme, is misogyny. Now, misogyny means a dislike of, even a hatred of women, a prejudice against them. So some historians have argued that the reason why witches were so persecuted wasn't really to do with the supernatural at all, but anxieties about female power and a hatred of women that led to women being persecuted as witches. So there's all kinds of interesting ideas around witches, the belief system, and perhaps what Shakespeare was doing with them. Now, the thing we cannot know are these two questions, really. Did Shakespeare share the beliefs and fears of his age? For me, Shakespeare is such an incredible genius and such huge insight into the human condition. I find it hard to believe that he believed that, you know, an old lady with a cat and a birthmark was somehow a source of the devil's power on earth. But of course, we can never impose 21st century beliefs on him. So we don't know whether he uses the witches in this play because he shares the beliefs of his age, or if he just wanted to please the king. And Shakespeare did that a lot. He knew James I hated witches, was very superstitious about witches, so using them as a representation of evil in this play is obviously a good way to please his new king. And also, obviously, this is a play about evil. And if you've got a figure that represents evil so strongly and so powerfully for your audience, it's an incredibly powerful dramatic device. So we can't know Shakespeare's own beliefs on the topic, we can't know the extent to which he agreed with the attitudes of his age, but we can see that he very cleverly takes those beliefs. The physical idea of evil, as represented by a witch, is the perfect dramatic device for this play. And the witches in Macbeth certainly represent the beliefs of the age. Shakespeare's made them sort of stereotypical in a way. They predict the future, they control the weather, they cast evil spells, they carry out wicked acts against ordinary men and women. These were some of the most common charges brought against women at the time who were accused of being witches. So, instantly recognisable to his audience that these women represent witchcraft and therefore represent evil. So as I say, the witches only make 3 appearances, yet all of their appearances are suitably dark. I think interesting to us now because in some ways their sections, written in the rhyming metre that they are, sound almost a bit playful and nursery rhyme-ish. But at the same time, we've got this kind of darkness of their scenes, which adds to the overwhelming sense of darkness that this play holds. So obviously they start the play, Act 1, Scene 1, the play opens and we've got the witches on the stage talking about evil deeds. Shakespeare obviously has chosen deliberately to have thunder and lightning. So a little bit of pathetic fallacy, setting up the sinisterness of the environment and the atmosphere by having this very sort of chaotic weather condition. And obviously Shakespeare repeats chaotic weather later, most significantly after Duncan dies. So we have more thunder and we have more wind and terrible weather after Duncan dies. So this idea that social order is going to be disrupted is really well symbolised through the weather. We meet the witches in the middle of a conversation, or towards the end of it, because they're planning to meet again, aren't they? So the fact they're planning to meet again suggests they've come to the end of their initial meeting. We've then got this really lovely contradictory line, when the battle's lost and won. So they're talking about the battle that Macbeth is fighting in, that we're going to find out more about in Act 1, Scene 2. Obviously, in a battle, there has to be a winner and a loser. But I always think this line is more interesting than that, in the sense that Macbeth himself will win and lose. He will win the battle, he will win the title Thane of Cawdor, but actually that'll be the beginning of the end for him in a sense. They arrange to meet in the evening at the setting of sun upon the heath, and they tell us they want to meet with Macbeth. And then obviously we've got this fantastic line to end it, fair is foul and foul is fair, hover through the fog and filthy air. The witch is talking riddles throughout, And the key idea here is they sit outside of human comprehension. What they say is meant to be riddly and confusing and a bit weird because we're not meant to understand them. There's things in the world we cannot understand. We cannot understand the forces of evil. We cannot understand some elements of supernatural. So Shakespeare deliberately makes them vague and mysterious. But what he also does is symbolises or represents some big themes and ideas. Fair and foul, again, we've got opposite words put next to each other. Goodness and darkness, goodness and evil coexist, and that's such one of the big ideas of this play. And then obviously they talk about the fog. Now, fog is a really common literary symbol used in a lot of texts because when it's foggy, we are blinded. We cannot see clearly. And I always think this symbolises or foreshadows Macbeth, that he will become blinded by ambition, unable to see what matters in life because he becomes blinded by ambition. So incredibly clever of Shakespeare to start the play with these three witches rather than our hero or our main character. It sets out their significance, so leading forward the action. It establishes that this is a play about darkness and evil. This isn't a play about heroism and goodness, and initiates foreshadows some big themes that will come about later. So it's not long till we meet the witches again. Act 1, Scene 2, we shift to Macbeth being all heroic and noble, and we find out how great he is. But then Act 1, Scene 3, the witches are back on stage. This reference here at the beginning, we find out what they've been up to since we last met them. And again, they've been doing some sort of stereotypically witchy things, killing swine. This was a really common allegation against witches at the time, that they killed livestock or animals. So Shakespeare's again using the beliefs of the age to create these characters. Whether he agrees with them or not, we don't know. But the scene, Act 1, Scene 3 gets interesting later when Macbeth arrives. So the witches and Macbeth meet, and this then starts the play. In a sense, Act 1, Scene 1 and Act 1, Scene 2 just introduce some characters. We actually start the play here because they make the predictions. Now, they never mention killing the king. That choice is entirely Macbeth's. They don't suggest to him that he should murder the king. They purely prophesy that he will become Thane of Cawdor, and after that, he will become the king. But by doing so, they stir up Macbeth's ambition. They also, again, speak in riddles. So after making their prediction to Macbeth, Banquo asks them to tell him what his future holds. And they tell him that he will be lesser than Macbeth and greater, not so happy, yet much happier. So again, talking in riddles, deliberately confusing, standing outside of easy comprehension, setting up this idea that there's things in human nature, things in the world, which are not easy to understand. They then are out of the play for a long time, and Macbeth takes control of his own choices. They have instigated this, they've set up this idea in his mind, but his ambition drives him to make his decision to kill King Duncan. So by the time the witches reappear, he has killed King Duncan, he has killed Banquo, and he returns to see them. Not because he's expecting good news, on the contrary, he's expecting bad news, but he feels that knowing what his future holds is better than living without knowing. And they say this wonderful line, "By the pricking of my thumb, something wicked this way comes." And we can see just how much from this Macbeth has fallen. Act 1, Scene 3, "Hail Macbeth, hail to thee, Thane of Cawdor, hail shall be the king." All very kind of respectful language about his status. By this point, he's a thing. He's barely even human anymore. He's completely stripped his own humanity away through his evil choices. So that is a summary of the witches. You will have learnt more in class, but I wanted a quick recap. please can you go to the slides on Show My Homework and complete this close activity, either by writing it out and filling in the gaps, or